Welcome. And this morning I'm reminded how quickly death can arrive. And I'd been expecting this pile of snow to fall off the roof and kill me any day, but fortunately it happened last night while I was sleeping. And today we're going to explore a little bit of the history of Salt Lake City and Utah in general. Now, I believe that the Mormons arrived in 1847, and personally, they seem to be one of the most recent reset civilizations that we can see in our short false history. And the Mormons originally began in Illinois, and they were persecuted in Illinois. Now, they were said to have built a temple called the Nauvoo Temple before eventually migrating west to Utah. And the Nauvoo Temple was originally dedicated in 1846, and yet when we look at a picture of this temple, it appears to be much older. And I find it really fascinating, the architecture that the Mormons supposedly built their structures in. And to present day, as we'll explore later in the video, we see a lot of what we're now calling Antiquitech, which I believe, and many of us believe, to be power generating devices. And when we look at a lot of similarities of modern day technology, we actually do see a lot of recognizable features that are apparently employed as architectural in the past, but yet may, and again I believe did, serve a greater purpose. Now, as with many great structures, of course this one burns down. Here we see a depiction, I should say, in 1852. Really interesting. I don't know why this angel is sideways. But again, a style that we would see in some other part of the world, built by some other kind of people. And the truth is that the renovations that they perform after this fire still seem to render it pretty much the same. As we can see in modern time, still has the same look, but has lost its authentic features. You know, these columns seem to be false columns now. But regardless, very amazing for that time period. But not that amazing, because, you know, Illinois, we see this architecture all over the place. And just like we see in the World's Fair, buildings that were thrown up almost overnight, we see a lot of similarities with these Mormon temples and the stories that they give us. So here we have a little list of temples, and here we see the Nauvoo Temple was destroyed. Here they're saying it was announced in 1840, I'm imagining announced to be built, destroyed by fire in 1848. And again, still seems to have this very similar look, but not quite the same. But now when we arrive to Utah, it gets even more interesting. So here we have a look at some of the first temples that were built in Utah. Now again, we have to remember that the Mormons arrived in Utah, and more specifically Salt Lake City, in 1847. 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children, and a bunch of animals arrive in 1847. And this is what they tell us the town may have looked like in 1850. Just little wood homes, very, very simple. Oxen, wagons, not much development in 1850. And here's an example of 1869, so a little less than 20 years later. Still reasonable, still conceivable. This is what we would expect. And here's an image in 1913. And, we can see images from 1903 and even much earlier that show a Salt Lake City looking like this, which still actually looks like this in modern times. Very, very similar. Many of these buildings are still standing. Back here you can see the old Salt Lake City courthouse, which looks like a massive castle. And we have these water towers. And back here we would have the temple. Some glorious structures up here that I don't believe are still there. These look like some grand buildings with spires back here. 1909. And again, this would have to be much older than 1909. And so this city is completely built out in under 50 years. We go from the 143 men that rolled into this city in 1847, and in less than 50 years we have a complete build-out and the level of sophistication that we would expect today. And as we can see here, not much has changed, just a little greener. Now when we look at these temples, we have this one in 1871. 1871, the St. George, Utah temple, dedicated in 1877. And really, the bulk of the people didn't begin settling until 1860. So now when we see something like this in 1871, give or take 10 years later, and I'm going to show you an older picture of this St. George temple. So here it is in present time, and here it is in old times. And this is one of the oldest pictures that I could find. And these characters do not look like Mormon settlers, nor do they look like they are the builders of this building. This building is built with an amazing architecture and looks old and weathered and abandoned, and I don't think there's any windows in it. We have this Antiquitech, as we often see, very, very intricate. We have these people that appear to be penciled in. They do not seem real, and it looks like there's been a lot of cropping here of perhaps what this used to look like. And it's pretty obvious that this has been altered in many ways to hide its true identity, at least what it looked like in the past. A lot of cropping here. And this probably looked like more of a castle that we're going to look at here soon. This person looks penciled in. A lot of people look penciled in here. But yet these characters, I believe, are authentic. And perhaps this was just to throw us off because there's never anybody really working on any of these structures. And the scaffolding doesn't seem to match the building style. I mean, if you have these materials and then you're going to use this kind of makeshift scaffolding, really suspicious and much older. And very difficult to find a lot of these images. Now I want to look at the Logan Temple. Logan is a little town, just like St. George, a little town in Utah, although St. George is growing very fast. Logan is located some miles north of Salt Lake City. And here they tell us that this temple was announced in 1876. 1876. So within 20 years or so of the Mormons arriving to Salt Lake City, they're now building structures like this. And again, we see this style all over the world. And for Mormon pioneers that just rolled up to a location with oxen and wagon and barely able to survive initially, and then to imagine that within 10 years they're going to be throwing up structures like this all over the state, not just in Salt Lake City where you would expect most building, especially with what we see in Salt Lake City, you would expect most of the buildings to resemble this. I mean, just to start out, okay, this makes sense. You know, you have to get materials and you're very limited with your oxen. How much could you transport? Wood or stone? It would only make sense to at least transport wood as opposed to stone with your limited resources. But no, that doesn't seem to stop them from building structures like this. And more impressively, like this. You're just arriving, you have so much going on, establishing food productions and housing and your churches, and you've just been persecuted from Illinois, and suddenly you arrive to Salt Lake City and you throw this baby up within 10 years. This monster. Now here in 1854, they're telling us this is an elevation plan showing the stones, the sun faces, the squares, the compass window accents. Again, they had so many resources that they could build it better, only to discard these elements and renovate within a short amount of time. And when we do look at earlier photos, what we see is this. The Salt Lake City Temple under construction. And really what I'm seeing here is a Salt Lake Temple already completed, and features probably being removed as opposed to being constructed, and only to perhaps add these spires later, or perhaps they were there all along. And the construction that we're seeing is just photoshopping of some kind, just to give the impression of construction. So again, 1872, granite being quarried for the temple in the Little Cottonwood Canyon, which is actually very far if you're moving on oxen. And I believe that this was probably already here. These amazing cuts, and these primitive people who really seem to be doing very little to create cuts like this. And again, who don't seem like Mormons at a glance. Now we'll have a little look at the Manti Temple. Again, we see these castle-like features and this Antiquitech. Not what we would expect from a people just settling. And this again is one of the older temples in Utah, dedicated in 1888. So this again would be within 15 years of the Mormons settling. Within 15 years, and this is actually not very close to Salt Lake City. This is down south quite a ways. So within 15 years they have time to send smaller parties out on wagons and horse and oxen, smaller parties to quarry stone in the same fashion and to build castle-like structures before there's even a population there, and to this day it's still a very small area. There'd be no need to build like this in small country town of Manti. And yet here it is, it still remains, and very interesting stories, actually, even in the Mormon history, about caves that were found around Manti, with a lot of ancient history. And we won't get into that, but worth mentioning. And finally, I wanted to look at some pictures of Old Salt Lake City that I feel further illustrates these points. Now, this picture is very interesting because this wall, this is actually a photo from, I believe it was the 1870s, but I just don't know about any of these dates, because this photo looks very old, and this wall looks very old. It's not here anymore. This, I believe, is the original wall that probably surrounded this castle. And in later photos, we have a lot of this Antiquitech removed, only to be replaced, but a little differently. So this must have been the true look. Again, judging by this wall and judging by this tree, that is actually a fairly old tree. Again, if people arrived within 20 years, I don't think you're getting trees to grow this large, or getting walls to weather in this fashion in such a short amount of time. No, this is older and is depicting actually what the city may have looked like upon inheriting it. And again, this Saltaire Palace that I've talked about before, out in the middle of nowhere. You know, that's the irony, is that these buildings are spread out all over Utah in a short amount of time, and it just makes no sense. I mean, you would need millions, not only millions of dollars, but millions of people to create all of these structures spread out all over the place. And that's just not what the narrative tells us. It just doesn't make sense. And this city is a much older city. Here's a look in 1875, looking north, from the north, looking southeast. So here we see this depiction of the Tabernacle Choir, the temple, again depicted in 1875. You know, within 15 years of the historical narrative, we see this complete build-out and this perfect grid in industry and trains. I mean, this canyon right here is apparently where they got the stone. This is Little Cottonwood. This is Big Cottonwood Canyon. Again, we have complete industry. This is the canyon, Parley's Canyon, that they would have come through. And here we have the courthouse. Again, supposedly built within 10 or 15 years. And finally, I want to focus on a little area in my neighborhood. And this is a Mormon temple, and it was originally a tabernacle, and this is what it looked like. And apparently it burnt down and was renovated and still looks the same. And really what we notice is it looks like a soul hasn't been here in at least 50 years. And we see these windows at ground level, and even a continuation of another structure that's even with these windows at ground level. And I believe there's much more under here. We're only seeing the top, and these stairs probably went down much further. And here it is in present day. And what really got me on this little subject in my own neighborhood was debating with a friend about false histories. And he told me the story of this bank in the neighboring town of mine. And we're located about 120 miles east of Salt Lake City. And this was one of the last places to be settled in Utah. And here we have this Bank of Vernal. Not the most impressive bank, but yet one of the most historical banks and one of the structures with the most interesting story in Vernal, Utah. Now, apparently at the time there were no bricks in this area, and there was no manufacturing of bricks, and it seems like everybody in this area knows this silly story of this bank building. And the Bank of Vernal is a registered historical building in Uintah County, known as the bank that was sent by mail. The Bank of Vernal was constructed in 1916. The builder took advantage of inexpensive parcel post rates to ship some 80,000 masonry bricks in 50-pound packages via the U.S. Post Office. The parcel brick shipments were transported from Salt Lake to Mack, Colorado by the Rio Grande Railroad, then proceeded to Watson via the narrow gauge Uintah Railway. Finally, to Vernal by wagon. Through steep roads, the full trip was over 420 miles. After the delivery was completed, the U.S. Post Service said they would never deliver anything over 200 pounds again. So 80,000 bricks, they're telling us, was shipped by mail to build this in 1915. All that for that. In fact, they pass this point in Colorado and then backtrack a little bit through wagon. So first by train, then by wagon, 80,000 bricks, enough to build all of this. And this just seems like an overkill story to explain how bricks got in an area where otherwise there should be no bricks. And the very building that I'm sitting in right now was built in 1903, right around the time that this town that I live in was developed. And really the story just seems to be as crazy as any of our stories, as we can see in this older map, that this region was actually occupied by a people that call themselves Tahugalank. And as I've recently found in some other maps that I will feature in another video, this was the home of the Mozambique nation, and perhaps a faction of Tartaria existed in this area. And this area was adorned with 6 noble cities. And so very interesting that it actually connects back to the Mississippi River in this time period. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Have a blessed day. Please like, comment, and subscribe.